This weekend is the 8-year anniversary of my dad passing away due to complications from being struck by lightning, which actually happened 2 years prior to him passing away. And I have always wanted to talk about this and tell this story on a wider scale and just never really knew how, but I thought I'd give it a go. So here we are. In 2014, my dad, who was a city firefighter, was working at a charity soccer game, and he, after the game, was walking through the parking lot to use the bathroom and was struck by lightning. He was hit in the head. The lightning traveled through his head, down his spine, through a leg, and then ultimately ended up coming out one of his feet. You can get struck by lightning and be relatively okay depending on the type of lightning strike and where it strikes your body. But his lightning strike was pretty much the worst kind that you could possibly have. So once the lightning struck him, his heart stopped. He obviously wasn't breathing, but there was a nurse behind him in the parking lot who saw it happen. And so she ran over and immediately started doing emergency care and ultimately was able to, I think, keep him alive until the ambulance came. And they took him to the hospital. So at the time, I was living in Nashville, Tennessee with my husband. We had been living there for a couple of years, and I got a call from, I think the hospital first, and then my uncle letting me know what had happened. My dad wasn't married, and so I was his next of kin, and they needed my permission to be able to do an emergency surgery on him, which was because when the lightning went through his body and came out of his leg, it was causing such extreme swelling that they needed to go in, cut the muscle fascia to reduce the overall swelling in his leg, which I obviously didn't really understand, but gave permission to do at the time. And then I flew out immediately to be with my dad in the hospital. When I arrived, it became clear pretty quickly that since lightning strikes are relatively rare, and especially this severity, the doctors really had no idea what was going to happen. They didn't know what his prognosis was or what the outcome might be, whether or not he had brain damage or any cognition. He was alive, but he was pretty much on life support, and he was being kept alive by, hospital intervention. And there was no way to know what was coming, and so really we just had to wait. So when I first saw my dad, he was extremely swollen. His entire body had swollen up probably 3 or 4 times its normal size, which was really disturbing. He was bruised and blackened. He had had surgery, so he had, some scarring and not scarring, but, surgical wounds. And ultimately all we could do was wait. So that's what we did. I was there with my dad's girlfriend at the time. His brother was there, and my aunt was there, my uncle's wife. And we just kind of waited to see what was going to happen. And for a while, it was really nothing. He was being kept alive by machines. He could not breathe on his own. They would try occasionally to remove some of the life support machines and see if he could function on his own, and he could not. Ultimately, they had to put a trach tube into his throat so that he could breathe. They ended up putting in a feeding tube over time so that he was getting nutrition. And essentially, he was in a coma for months. And he was moved out of the intensive care into like a specialty hospital just so that they could try to, keep him alive at this point, even though we had no idea what was coming next. Eventually he started to come around and come to and become more cognizant, and it became pretty clear right away that his brain function was not normal. They started to compare it to a traumatic brain injury. And so that was really challenging. We also started to recognize pretty quickly that even though his spinal cord had not been, broken or fractured in that kind of way, because the lightning had traveled down his spinal cord and because our body sort of runs on like electrical circuiting, lightning had traveled down that spinal cord and essentially short-circuited his body. And so he no longer had function of most of his body below his neck, which was also really challenging. I think one of the hardest parts about this whole thing was that prior to the accident, my dad was such a active and adventuring type of guy. He rode a motorcycle. He loved to go fishing. He would take fishing trips with his friends and with his brother every year. He was an avid hiker, golfer, bike rider. Just he loved to be active. Kayaker, you know, he did a lot. And I know that this type of injury, something that no longer allowed him to use his limbs or his body, was something that he would have never wanted. He didn't have a DNR, but I think ultimately if he had known what the outcome would be, he would have chosen to not be resuscitated, but it doesn't really matter because that's not what happened. So we started to realize that he did not have function for most of his body anymore, and that his brain function was also not super typical. He also couldn't speak. He had a trach tube in, which did make it hard to speak. Anyway, he could mouth words, but no sound would come out. After being at the different hospitals for a few months and recognizing that this wasn't going to change probably quickly and things weren't going to improve quickly, my husband and I decided to move back to Columbus so that we could be close to my dad because, as I said, he wasn't married. I have a brother who wasn't living in Columbus at the time, and he had his girlfriend. They had been together for off and on for about 2 years at this point, but they weren't married. They didn't live together. It wasn't all that serious. However, that would all change going forward, and that's where the drama comes in, and I can talk about that, I think, in another video. But anyway, so we moved back to Columbus, and I was in school at the time, so I had to transfer schools up to Ohio State. I needed to find a job so I could be working, but it needed to be flexible. So I found a customer service job and was seeing my dad on a regular basis and going to school and doing the whole thing. Eventually we had to find a long-term care living facility for my dad to be in because he, again, had no real function for his body, couldn't care for himself, and obviously we were not equipped to care for that type of situation. So we moved him into a long-term care center, where you would send your grandparents, I guess, at a later stage of their life. And once he got there, he showed minor improvements. He started being able to move his fingers just very slightly, moving his toes very slightly. Eventually he was able to start to speak again, though we realized his brain function truly wasn't ever where it was before the accident. He had decent long-term memories, he could remember things from when I was a kid or from years past, but his short-term memory was essentially absent. He didn't remember a month prior to the accident. He didn't remember talking about things that we talked about yesterday. He didn't remember saying things. He was very easily convinced. So if I asked him a question and he gave me an answer and then I told him that wasn't the answer and that's not what he thought, he would just change his mind, right? He was just very easily swayed. So we continued on like that really for another 2 years. He was in a facility